Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Inwald, and today I'm going to read chapters from How to Have It All and Keep Your Sanity, book I wrote when I was running my company and wanted to help give some of my clients really good idea of some major tips that would help them manage their businesses and stay on the right track so that they could be successful and profitable at the same time as having a balance with their families and knowing how to have a good time too. So, my first chapter is the letter M for motivate others to help you. Lead others as you would have others lead you. The ability to install and instill excitement in other people to do something that helps you is a skill practiced by the most effective managers and world leaders. While there are coercive methods, these usually do not last for the long term, since unhappy followers eventually are bound to rebel. There are several positive ways to motivate people, and each successful manager has his or her own style. However, I've noticed three common techniques used by effective leaders that are particularly useful. The first involves always doing your best so that others will view your enthusiasm and hard work as a model and look for ways to help you. Sometimes people find ways to help without even being asked, just because they are so inspired by high energy, competence, and a positive disposition. My friend Sue is a very dedicated high school math teacher. Her husband's company transferred him to a new city, and when they moved, my friend worried that she might not find another teaching position. She began working as a substitute teacher for 6 months, hoping a position would open and that she could apply for a full-time job. One day, she went into a new classroom where the students were working on a subject she had taught in her old school. The regular teacher had not left any lesson plans, but Sue told the class that she would go ahead and teach the subject the way she had taught her own students in the past. She easily could have sat down at the desk and told the class to do some problems in their workbooks during that period. Instead, she asked them to tell her what they were working on and picked up where the regular teacher had left off. As usual, Sue did her best to use any time she was in a classroom to the students' advantage. The next day, she was substituting again in the same school, and the head of the math department came up to her in the lunchroom, saying he had to talk to her. For a minute, she panicked, wondering what she'd done wrong in the short time she'd been working at this school. The department chairman then explained that, unbeknownst to her, one of the students in her class the day before happened to be the son of the assistant superintendent of the school system. The student had been so impressed with my friend's teaching skills and obvious dedication to teaching, regardless of her position, and obvious dedication to her education and desire to teach math, that he had gone home and told his father that he absolutely must find a way to have her as a full-time math teacher in the school. Sue was offered a part-time job immediately, and the administrator apologized for not being able to offer her a full-time job right away. Apparently, she had too much experience to be hired at the lowest salary level, but she quickly agreed to accept the lower salary in order to work in a regular position. Since the teachers' union would not accept that idea, the other administrators preferred to hire a younger and less experienced teacher at a lower salary. My friend had to wait until the following year to secure her full-time job. It was clear that had it not been for this unusual circumstance, it would have been extremely difficult for Sue to enter this particular job market. She was thrilled to be given the part-time position so quickly, due solely to her admirable habit of always trying her best, wherever she was, to motivate students and help them learn the subject of math. By showing initiative and doing her job so well, she unwittingly motivated a teenage boy with a watchful eye and a powerful father to help her. The second technique that's useful in motivating others is to ask those you supervise to do things only if you are willing to do them yourself. The best management approach is to try every job yourself for a while, unless you are not qualified to do it, to make sure that it actually can be done the way you want it to be done. Having realistic expectations for the people who work for you is crucial for success of any group. One of the earliest jobs that I had was to teach swimming to young children. I always got into the pool and showed the children how to put their faces in the water to blow bubbles. One day I was amazed to watch a teacher trying to show students this idea without doing it herself. The students were staring at her while she talked about putting their faces in the water and blowing out air. However, when they tried to do it, only one child out of the 8 students was successful. I knew that it would be a lot easier if this teacher would jump into the water and show them. Being too lazy to do this, she was unsuccessful in her teaching mission. She did manage to stay dry, though, which may have been her personal mission for that day. Perhaps one of the most difficult things to do is motivate others voluntarily to put their lives on the line for an outside cause. How then do military leaders manage to do this in times of war? I recently had the privilege of reading the unpublished memoirs and letters of an 81-year-old neighbor who fought in both World War II and in the Korean War. His story demonstrates better than any business-related example how a person can motivate others through his own behavior. In this case, my friend's insistence upon doing everything himself that he asked his soldiers to do enabled most of them to return home safely after the war. I've included several excerpts from his letters here because his management of himself and others, in his own words, presents my view of the perfect example of a good and effective motivator. Joe is the fourth of 5 surviving children, the son of a hardworking barber during years of depression. He joined the Army in 1941 and worked his way up to becoming a platoon sergeant in his second tour of duty during the Korean War. Although an animation artist by trade, he was assigned to psychological warfare in a unit that set up loudspeakers in different positions between the enemy and the American front lines, known as No Man's Land. His unit's job also was to check to see if the loudspeakers worked, and then to set them up in another location after broadcasting audio tapes that were designed to convince the enemy to surrender. In his memoirs, he wrote, "After being in Korea for a couple of months, I was unhappy with the way we were trained to put the speakers out in no man's land. We would crawl out on our hands and knees, holding on to a guideline in the pitch dark that went by the minefields that our troops had to put out for our protection. We would try to aim the speaker into the valley where the enemy was dug in. One day at the war room, I said I thought I could do it a better way. They said, as platoon sergeant, I could try anything. The lieutenant and I went up to a position after lunch. In broad daylight, I took a speaker and crawled out, well able to see where I was going, and located a well-hidden location, aiming the speaker exactly where I wanted it to hit. I was well covered by the infantry and a tank. My opinion was that they would not fire artillery or mortar at one person in no man's land. Ammunition was too valuable to waste on one man. I was right, although they did fire small weapons at me. At that distance, I could see the rounds hit close by, but even if they had hit me, it would not do any serious damage. From that day on, all of my teams did the same. We never had a mishap that way. We also became more effective with our speakers. My only thought was to save us from accidentally setting off one of our own mines and probably killing or wounding one of us. I was not trying to be a hero. I love life as much as anyone, and I was determined to get back to my family in one piece." The men in this unit worked 7 days a week from 6 to 12 hours each day, getting their food from any troops they were with at the time. Joe made a point never to set up these loudspeakers in a location where he would feel uncomfortable staying at that post himself. He often stayed on the post with his men, even though this was not required of him as a sergeant. He wrote letters home about how it was so cold at the front that his food was frozen at times. In making a personal rule that he would not ask people to do what he was not willing to do himself, he protected the lives of those in his unit. Unfortunately, other military bosses cared more about their careers than about the lives of their men. On June 25, 1953, Joe wrote about this incident in his letter to his wife. "I had a terrible spat with my lieutenant today about the position he chose for one of our teams while we were in the war room. I always pick spots that are not too vulnerable to enemy fire. The only way to get to this position was in an armored vehicle, and it would always come under fire. I told the lieutenant that he and I must put the equipment out and spend the first night of broadcast on the position. He didn't like the idea, but I made it obvious that if he didn't do it, I wouldn't consider him much of a leader. He reluctantly went with me. When we got back, I told him I thought we would rue the day we put them out there. On June 28th, Joe wrote again. I don't know if it's getting in the papers, but the enemy is trying to prove something even at the cost of many lives. Someone must be saying special prayers for me, as I've had so many close calls. For instance, one day I was at the front with some VIPs when they started a heavy barrage right at the position we were at. We were in a heavy bunker made up of 12 by 12 beams and loaded with sandbags. By this time, I knew the pattern of fire. The shells were about the same size as our 250 millimeter howitzer. They had fired several rounds over us and some right in front of us. I yelled to all the guys at the position that they were zeroing in directly at us. I can't tell why, but I told all of them to get out of the bunkers and run for foxholes, which we all did. We scattered all over, and the next hit was directly on the bunker we had just vacated. The whole thing caved in. I don't know if any of us would have been killed, but I'm sure we would have had many casualties. There have been many such close calls, and I do believe it's the strength of prayer that is saving me. In a letter he sent home to his wife on July 5th, Joe wrote, I'm heading back up in the front, but I'm taking most of my gear because I have a lot of catch-up work to do, so I'll stay on the front line. Right now it's pouring rain, and we're not allowed to have tops on our Jeeps for security reasons, so naturally we get soaked. Seems the boys are having trouble setting up programs, so I'll help them get started. It may be a week or more, but I won't leave until I'm sure they can handle it. The more I see here, the more I get disgusted with the way things are run, like rationing ammunition and telling us when to fire and when to move forward or backward. On July 8th, Joe wrote, Today I was packing up the new speaker equipment in my Jeep to take out to the listening post when Barry stopped me and insisted he would take the stuff himself with the 2 interpreters and he would do the broadcast. We had a little friendly tug of war, and he still insisted that I was too tired and deserved a break. Before I had gotten here, I had delivered 2 speakers to 2 other positions, and I had to agree that Barry was right. Besides, he said he could do a better job on the enemy with his M1 rifle than I could with my carbine and my Webley revolver. I told him that if anything was to break out, his orders are to take what equipment he could and get the hell out. I told him he's Signal Corps, not infantry. With that, he drove off to the listening post where he would transfer everything to the armored vehicle and out to the broadcast position. On July 10th, Joe wrote home again. The Chinese attacked full force, overrunning the whole area. 3 men and myself were pinned down in our small bunker right under their noses by small arms and mortar and hand grenades. We could hear yelling in Chinese and English. The 4 of us prayed out loud, and I believe our prayers were heard. At daybreak, suddenly, the flap on the bunker swung open, and we fully expected to see Chinese. There stood an American lieutenant with a machine gun in his hand. He was flabbergasted. He couldn't believe that the enemy hadn't killed us. We came out to see a scene that will live in our minds forever. Everywhere we looked were bodies and wounded, both Chinese and American. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the dampness from all the rain and graves registration putting bodies back in black bags made for a true nightmare. It wasn't over yet because medics were trying to save whoever they could, not only our own, but the enemy as well. We wandered around trying to be of some help, but now I had to get to my work. It was my responsibility as platoon sergeant to find my speaker team. I managed to get to the spot where Barry and the 2 interpreters were last seen. I met one of the boys who was on the hill, and I asked if he saw Barry. He said yes, and that Barry, realizing that there was no way to get out, had stayed and fought it out with his M1. He was hit by mortar, and this guy was sure he was dead. While at the position, I checked out all the wounded and dead bodies for Barry. I was looking mostly for his dog tags, which would have proved for sure that he was dead. I also went to graves registration and checked every body and parts of bodies to try and find some definitive proof of his death. I had no luck. I then called my lieutenant back at our command post to make my report. He had the nerve to ask me if they'd gotten the broadcast in before we were overrun by the enemy. I told him in no uncertain terms what I thought of him, and I would have more to say when I next saw him. In August 1953, Joe wrote, "The other day I wrote a letter to the boy's mother. We still can't report him as killed in action, so we still list him as missing. I didn't have to write this letter, but I felt I wanted to. I told her how I'd felt about his being missing and that I was the last person to speak with him when he left our bunker. I told her he was a good soldier and a fine young man. She wrote and thanked me for the letter and asked me to write again. I think when I get home, I will try to see his parents." At the end of August 1953, Joe left the front lines for the last time. He was recognized for his bravery and leadership by being presented with a meritorious award, a Medal for Valor under enemy fire from the U.S. Army. By taking responsibility for his actions and going beyond the minimum requirement for doing his job, Joe handled tragedy with leadership and grace. When he returned home, Joe and his wife raised a family of 3 children that now have grown to include 9 grandchildren. However, he never has forgotten the men who took his place in the firing lines at the front. It is true that power-hungry bosses can undermine a person's good efforts. However, Joe's insistence on joining in the work of his unit, regardless of his lieutenant's attitude, resulted in the initiation of safer practices and procedures, a life-saving anticipation of imminent danger in the bunker, and the loyalty of Joe's soldiers that ultimately saved his life. While the tragedy of war cannot be underestimated and stakes are not as high in most business or management jobs, the characteristics of an effective leader who can motivate others to listen and act on his or her behalf remain the same. The third skill that's often well developed in people who are excellent at motivating others is that of delegating tasks, as well as decision-making whenever possible. In order to grow from a one-person operation or department into an efficient company or group, it's necessary to practice giving up some of the control over your project or business decisions. This is true whether you work in a large or small organization. If managers insist on hovering over every detail, micromanaging each procedure, they'll drive the people crazy who they wish to motivate to work for them. Also, many employees worry that they must be doing something wrong or that their bosses don't trust them when they're overmanaged. With too much direction and supervision, employees soon lose their sense of independence or autonomy that is essential for everyone in order to maintain a feeling of well-being. Regardless of the age of a person, it's a lot easier to inspire others to do something if they believe they have some choice in at least some aspect of the situation. For example, you'll receive much more cooperation from a child when you ask him to choose which of 2 shirts to put on or which of 2 vegetables should be made for dinner tonight than if the decision is made for them. I recently met a woman who owned a baking business. She's worked out of her home for the past 15 years baking pies and delivering them herself to local stores. She said that she was tired and would like to slow down at this point. When I asked if she had anyone helping her, she replied that the only person she really could count on was herself. She commented that she only had one young helper coming in after school to do some packaging on a part-time basis. She stated that she didn't want other people doing the work since she would rather be the one for people to complain to if there was a mistake. She also always wanted to be the one to receive the compliments when she'd done a good job. Of course, as a business owner or manager, the compliments and complaints stop at the top, regardless of how many employees are involved in the process. This woman's comments reminded me of a major mistake I made myself as an entry-level entrepreneur. In the early days, I too wanted to do everything myself. I enjoyed the process of learning how to create tests, conduct research, advertise, lecture, design trade show exhibits, go to meetings, and collapse at the end of each full day. I was doing the work of several people at once, and much later, it did take 3 people to cover the jobs I was doing myself. However, these 3 people could do my jobs and much more without collapsing, and they also could bring in new ideas about how the work could be done more efficiently. In other words, they could help the business grow in a way that one person, no matter how skilled or hardworking, could never do alone. It took me a long time to realize that my idea of doing it all myself with a few part-time employees was really just a rationalization. It was my way of maintaining control so that I could feel powerful and exhausted at the same time. It was true that I would reap all of the benefits. However, the cost would be great, and I would have very little time to enjoy those benefits. I realized how flawed my reasoning was when I had the opportunity to take a close look at the personality styles of more successful entrepreneurs. I already had noticed that I was working at a more frantic pace than most other business owners, all males, who seemed to buy and sell businesses in my general field with ease and profit. I was focusing on most of the details of my company and tended to become involved in nearly every project of the business. I hired people who were not qualified to take over the jobs I had created for myself and felt that without my active participation, my company would fall apart. In 1988, 7 years before William Goldman popularized the concept of emotional intelligence in his book on this subject, I had developed and published information about my success quotient theory, a theory that proposes that success comes from a combination of characteristics, including work ethic, social skills, goal orientation, as well as academic ability. I also had developed my test, the HPPSQ, or Hilson Personnel Profile Success Quotient, that measured personality characteristics such as work ethic, drive, and social skills. In this test, I included a scale about the tendency to procrastinate. In order to see how the scales worked, I brought copies of the test to a convention where there would be many successful business owners and managers. I asked people who stopped by our exhibit at this convention to take the test in return for a free evaluation of their results. As part of this exercise, I asked for anonymous information about salary level, company size, and other details that would give me some idea of exactly how successful these business owners and managers have been in their companies. After looking at the profiles, I talked with several of these people, mostly males, who had done extremely well and were making far better strides in growing their businesses than I had made in growing mine. One man in particular made a lasting impression. He'd built a business that had been included in the Inc. magazine list of the fastest growing businesses in the United States. His business was bringing in millions of dollars, and his personality profile also was vastly different from my own. His score, indicating a tendency to procrastinate, was much higher than mine, and his social sensitivity score was much lower, meaning he was much less sensitive. I was fascinated to see this profile and interviewed him on the spot to see how these scales reflected our different behavior patterns. In the course of our conversation, I discovered that he believed his success was based on his ability to delegate responsibilities to people who were more qualified than he was to meet the various challenges of his business. His high candor score suggested that he was able to admit to his own shortcomings and had good insight about his abilities relative to those of others. When I asked if he tended to procrastinate, he laughed, saying, "Oh, yes, that's why I make sure to surround myself with very detail-oriented people. That's how I get so much done. I delegate everything and then go on to the next problem or project." At that time, I actually was shocked by his comments, since I always thought that I should become more involved in every project in a more detailed way. I realized that while this man was involved with his employees and their projects, he was not doing the detailed work himself. There's a big difference between demonstrating a job in order to show others how it can be done, starting them on a reasonable path, and doing it all yourself. I made a vow to amend my own style and to concentrate more on learning to demonstrate and then delegate tasks to others. I also learned from this man that to be a successful manager, it's important to be honest with yourself about your own shortcomings, and yet not to be overly sensitive or always trying to fix other people's problems. My own scores on social sensitivity were quite high compared to others, reflecting my tendency to try to keep everyone happy around me at work, regardless of the situation. I often thought that when an employee wasn't doing well at his or her job, it was my fault for not being a better boss. I realized that, like me, this man was an extrovert and was very socially oriented. He was candid about his shortcomings and intent on his goals. However, the big difference between us was that he did not let other people's problems stop him from pursuing his goals. When an employee wasn't doing well, he carefully evaluated the situation and then was comfortable in making the decision to find only the best people for the job to surround him. After seeing this man's profile, I later noticed this pattern whenever I tested a highly successful manager. I also recognized that many women, perhaps because of how they are raised to be peacemakers in the family, are overly sensitive to social situations and may be reluctant to discipline others for fear of being disliked. In one research study, I found that females were being terminated from the job of correction officer at a much higher rate than were males from the same job. In contrast, the males had a higher number of disciplinary actions and negative reports in their records. I immediately concluded that this must be because of the old boys network in this organization. Was I wrong? My theory was that the male bosses were more comfortable disciplining other males and may have avoided confrontations with poorly performing female employees until it was too late. My theory expanded to include the idea that the male supervisors probably did not like dealing with women who might cry if they were formally disciplined. This would mean that males were being given more opportunities from their male supervisors to correct their behavior before the situation ended with them being fired from the job. Unfortunately, I soon discovered that my brilliant theory was totally wrong. I found out that the managers of the women were mostly females, while the male managers supervised the male employees in this organization. Then I realized it was my test sensitivity scale scores that made the difference. Female managers tend to score higher on the scale than males, and like me, initially may be more reluctant to give negative feedback to others. In any case, I've found that many effective managers have the combination of scores indicating a willingness to admit to their own shortcomings, along with average, not high, scores on social sensitivity. In summary, developing the skills of a good motivator includes putting forth your best effort and maintaining the balance of becoming involved in the jobs of employees as a model and leader without doing the jobs for them. While some people may do this more naturally than others due to their inborn personality styles, this doesn't mean that the habits of successful motivators cannot be learned. By becoming aware of your own shortcomings and working with them, you can enhance your skills and improve results. Finally, it's important to remember that people are motivated by more than money. And becoming a role model by approaching each job with enthusiasm and letting those you manage know how their efforts will contribute to the goals of your organization, you'll go a long way towards building an effective team. To implement the M for motivate others to help you, here are several exercises to try. 1, catch yourself practicing a skill alone when you are not giving your best effort. Change your attitude to one where each attempt is with your best effort every time, whether or not anyone else is watching. 2, teach someone a new skill by demonstrating how it's done yourself in a step-by-step manner. Practice your demonstration before you do it. 3, select a task that you usually do yourself. Delegate that job to someone else after you've given the person some training. Then practice the art of leaving the person alone. Set a time to check progress after the task has been completed. And 4, monitor yourself so that you approach your work with enthusiasm, making sure to tell people exactly how their work will make a contribution to the end result. Always add your thanks and words of appreciation at the end, so they'll want to help you again. The next chapter I want to read is for the N letter. Negotiate for win-win solutions. The woods are full of them, by Alexander Wilson. That was his quotation. Finding solutions to problems that will make both you and others happy is one of the most challenging tasks in business and personal life. It also is an excellent way to make friends and keep them. What is one person's pleasure often is another's pain. In a competitive environment, whether it be mating or selling commodities, The option of finding a comfortable solution for everyone frequently is overlooked in favor of the I win, you lose mentality. While animal instincts for survival and continuation of the species may dictate that winning at all costs in some situations is critical, carrying this concept into modern daily life as a standard often does not lead to the most satisfying solutions. For instance, there are several individual sports that are highly competitive, are played by having participants regularly face their opponents, and require an I win, you lose ending. In these sports, such as tennis, fencing, and boxing, the most successful athletes must develop a very thick skin and aggressive attitude where their opponents are concerned. Sometimes these competitors transfer an apparently belligerent attitude, as well as a communication style of direct and immediately aggressive confrontation into the outside world, because it's such an ingrained habit to try to crush the opposition. There's a seemingly endless stream of news stories about previously celebrated athletes who later are arrested for violent behavior in their private lives. These crimes may result from their inappropriate reliance on intimidation and aggression rather than negotiation skills in their interactions with others. Some self-development and leadership training programs devote a large percentage of time toward demonstrating how to break the thinking that results in combat rather than negotiation. Creative games involving two teams supposedly opposing each other result in lessons teaching how both teams will lose if they don't develop moderate solutions that help everyone. The idea is to cultivate acceptance of a solution where I lose a little, you lose a little, but I also win something and you win something too. The goal of successful business negotiations is to have each party leave the table feeling that they have triumphed, even if the solution is not clearly in favor of one side or the other. The problem with feuding in the modern world, aside from any physical destruction that can result, is that in many cases it is only the lawyers who eventually walk away with the spoils. The ability of individual competing parties to negotiate depends upon the integrity and good faith of each party. Just as a couple is doomed to failure if one of the two people really is not interested in maintaining the relationship, any conflict in business will end with negative results unless a decision maker on each side of that conflict keeps the win-win solution in mind at all times. Most conflicts require creative ideas to make everyone happy, and it can take some time to develop these ideas. Meanwhile, tempers need to be controlled, which is easier said than done, while the details of these solutions are worked out and implemented. In my experience, there have been several times when potential conflicts turned into friendships, or at least into collegial relationships, because of the win-win solutions that unexpectedly were created. One attorney who represented a public agency where I previously worked came to me with a request for information about a recommendation my staff had made in another agency about a job candidate who now worked for his client. This individual had killed someone on the job, and a lawsuit was pending. My report had recommended that the officer not be hired, while this attorney's client had hired the person without conducting an adequate psychological evaluation or checking for previous negative psychological reports. The lawyer expected me to hand him my report and at best give him a brief interpretation of the test results. Instead, I provided him with valuable political and professional information about internal procedures in both agencies that he would have had little chance of discovering without my assistance. Because of this information, he was able to do a much better job advising his client. In return, he assisted me in educating city officials about the ethical and professional issues involved in evaluating officers. Years later, he recommended me for a consulting contract with another organization, and I gave him some advice about how to handle a problem he was having with his son. Creating a win-win relationship out of a potentially adversarial one was beneficial to both of us. Recently, a similar situation arose involving a different lawsuit. Without warning, I received a subpoena requiring me to submit hundreds of test and research documents within a few days to lawyers representing a city agency with which I had no prior contact. The attorneys bringing the lawsuit had listed one of my tests as a possible alternative to what this city previously had used to screen police officers. Due to a change in the law, my listing test was no longer suitable for use in the way they intended, and I didn't want to hire an attorney to fight for an order of protection. I had to do that once before when a psychologist who didn't follow recommended standard procedures and had misused the same test issued me a subpoena to help him defend himself in a well-deserved lawsuit. That time, it had cost me several $1,000s in attorney's fees. In this case, I saw no reason why I should be required to gather so many documents when they couldn't be used anyway. However, without an order of protection, the law required it. Instead of entering into the adversarial process by hiring an attorney, I successfully negotiated a win-win solution with the attorneys who had sent me the subpoena. It was arranged that while they would not pursue the subpoena, and in return, I would provide them with information about testing that would help them in their case. Once you make a conscious effort to search for win-win solutions in any potential adversarial situation, new and creative possibilities will appear more readily. For example, my husband and I owned 2 barns on an old farm property where we took summer vacations. The man who used to own the farm had retained lifetime use of one of the barns. This 3-horse barn was built in 1845 with post and beam roof construction and still had the original logs with their bark intact in the ceilings of the hayloft. With the man's approval, we fixed the crumbling foundation so that this barn would not fall down, and in the process, changed some of the doors back to their original and smaller sizes. After we had made this barn functional again and had cleaned 1 truckload of garbage and old paint cans so that it was possible to do the restoration work, the local historical society presented us with one of its annual awards for historical preservation. The next year, the man who used this barn purchased a large boat and failed to measure its width correctly. It turned out to be a few inches too wide to fit through the new but old-style doors. One day, he came to me insisting that if I didn't get a carpenter to completely rebuild the wall and doors to the width he needed to store his new boat, he would put a match to the whole thing. For several weeks, we argued back and forth about this situation. I told him he wouldn't have been able to put anything in the barn, and certainly not a large motorboat, if I hadn't restored the foundation and cleaned out the main floor for him. He argued that it should have been preserved just the way it was when he sold it, 2 owners before us. At that time, this barn had a metal garage door with paint cans and old tractor motor parts piled to the ceiling in front of it, preventing any vehicle's access. Nothing in the deeds specified anything about these issues, and it simply granted him the use of the barn. Tired of arguing and unwilling to rebuild the newly restored doors, I finally came up with a more creative solution to our problem that worked. I offered to clean out a section of our other barn so that he could use that one for the storage he needed, and still maintain his exclusive control over the first barn. I gave him a separate key to the door so that no one would have access except him. After a year had passed, he was so pleased with this unexpected solution that he gave me the key to the barn he'd use of so that I could use it in the summertime. We had both compromised in order to have a win-win result rather than a potential lawsuit over such a petty issue. Whether about barns or business, the best solutions are those that help everyone get what they need. Figuring out how to go about doing this with the least amount of hassle and expense is the challenge. To implement the end for negotiate for win-win solutions, here are some exercises. 1. When you're presented with a problem that appears to require that either you or the other side must lose, think of 3 ways in which you could compromise and still retain what you absolutely need. 2. When negotiating for something you need, put yourself in the shoes of all the members of the opposing party and determine what it is that is most important to them. 3. Look outside of the immediate problem area to see if there are compromises or creative solutions that you haven't considered due to your own false pride or tunnel vision. Consult with others for a more objective view of the situation. And 4, ask the opposition for suggestions and then modify any proposals with a counteroffer so that you can retain what you need in an eventual compromise. That concludes the chapter N for negotiate for what you need. Now I'm going to move on to one step at a time. This is my favorite chapter, the one I have most difficulty with because I tend to do a lot of things and I get excited about each one and tend to jump from one thing to the other. Does that resonate with any of you listening or watching? Yes. Well, this chapter is key to getting things done and doing them in an effective and proficient manner. One step at a time. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Lao Tzu. I've been putting off the writing of this book for 2 years now. When I first got the idea, I was too busy to settle down and start the hard part of actually doing it. Instead, I procrastinated and did other things. One day, I realized that if I didn't start and finish writing about my ideas immediately, I might not have an opportunity to write this book for another 2 or 3 years. So, how do you start a project as large as writing a book without becoming overwhelmed by the enormity of the task? I finally found my inspiration, one step at a time. I decided to copy or temporarily borrow what someone else had done. First, I looked for a book I recently had read on a topic similar to the one I would write. I looked at the number of pages in that book and actually counted up the words on one page. I liked the size and type style of the book, so all I needed to do was figure out how much I needed to write each day in order to finish my own book on schedule. It was both easy and doable when I approached the daunting task of book writing this way. I figured out that if I wrote 1,500 words or only 2 full typewritten pages with a size 10 font each day, I could reach my goal. I decided that it didn't matter what I wrote, as long as I put my ideas down in a way that I could edit later. This took off the pressure about making it perfect the first time. There are many ways to keep a task or project under control. Just like studying for a test, it usually is better to do a little bit each day rather than cramming at the last minute. Of course, there are lots of excuses for why we can't get to it today. There's an audit coming up next week. The company president needs a report yesterday. A meeting, a phone call, the delivery of a refrigerator. You know that routine. Then you forget all the details explaining why you couldn't do something you wanted to do. And you sit helplessly at the end of the year asking, now, why didn't I work on that? It could have been done by now if I just had concentrated more. Unfortunately for all of us, the discipline required to focus on our most important tasks, on our most important work for years at a time, is a learned skill that needs constant practice. Of course, if you do manage to work on the most important projects, you then have to accept the fact that there may not be enough time in each day for everything else you want to do. I once was in the audience when an expert on organization suggested making a list each day with the 3 most important things you wish to accomplish. I had found that such a list usually contains 2 things too many. What has worked for me in recent years is doing one thing on that most important list each day. I also find it easier to do that one thing early in the day rather than starting other tasks that may distract my attention. I should say that right now it's 7:12 in the morning. I started very early today because my one task is to read my favorite chapters to you and make a Zoom video that will work as an hour-long video just to practice loading it onto YouTube and having fun doing it. My most awake hours are in the morning, and this is why I've started so early. People often ask me how I can accomplish so many things at once. Raised a family, ran a business, practiced music, etc. For me, it's all about keeping the focus on the present moment and trying to give full attention to that task or project at hand. It's easy to become distracted. However, if I give myself even 10 or 15 minutes in the beginning of each day to focus on the smallest steps toward reaching my long-term goal, such as typing those 1,500 words right now, I can do it. Once that one most important step for the day has been accomplished, it's time for a rest. I know that anyone reading this who knows me will be laughing right now, but I'm serious. Even if it's simple mental note to yourself that you've done all you really wanted to do today already, you can relax and let the rest of the day unfold. You've met your one step is all that's required goal, preferably early in the day, and any additional accomplishments are extra. You know you're going to keep on doing things all day, but if you do this first thing, and I finish reading a few chapters to you right now, I know I'm going to feel good, I'm going to feel accomplished, and I'm going to go on to the next thing on my list that I might have wanted to do as well. I first indulged in the idea of a that's enough personal accomplishment party when I finished the requirements for earning my PhD in psychology. I'll never forget the feeling I had walking up a city street one beautiful spring morning to hand in the final copy of my doctoral dissertation to the university library. To explain, I'll digress a little. I was 24 years old at the time and had struggled with a professor for 2 years, did not appreciate my interest in things other than psychology. I later found out that one of my friends in the same program had told this professor that I was performing in plays while receiving the full fellowship granted to me from the National Institute of Mental Health. The professor thought that my evenings spent acting were an inappropriate use of my time and somehow insulting to her. She also was angry with me for making a joke about planning to get my PhD and then marrying my medical school student boyfriend and having children, which I actually did later. The professor had thought that I was serious about giving up psychology, and for 2 years I didn't understand why she was trying to force me out of her doctoral program. Despite the fact that I had directly asked her for an explanation, I only discovered why she'd been so enraged with me several years later when I hired a graduate of that same program to work with me for me in my psychological test business. That student had heard the details that finally explained why I'd had such a tortured time as a graduate student. In any case, when I carried the final draft of my dissertation to the library, I said to myself, you have just accomplished the near impossible. You've worked really hard to do this and have shed a few tears in the process. More than a few, actually. You really have earned the title doctor, and now you have the choice to keep on working in this field or to retire and do other things with your life. Whatever you do next, no one, not even that professor, can take this accomplishment away. From that point on, I made a habit of congratulating myself on achieving even the smallest of steps towards larger goals. Nearly 20 years later, when I decided it would be fun to learn to sing, despite the fact that I was unable to sing on pitch, sounded terrible when I tried and had been told not to bother trying, I used this method to keep myself focused and positive. Perhaps learning to sing for a non-singing person can be seen as the ultimate test for using the principle of one step at a time. First, most people don't realize that singing is a skill just like reading English or learning Chinese. While some people are naturals, most decent singers work at honing specific skills so they'll sound better over time. Since it's not common knowledge that it takes about 10 years of training for someone with relative pitch, a sense of which notes are higher or lower than the others, to learn to sing well, quick judgments often are made about those who dare to sing in public. It's interesting that even one missed note or pitch will be enough for some people to judge the singer as no good or to judge an accomplished singer as all washed up. For me, a non-singer trying to sing for the first time, it was important to take off the pressure of singing well. Singing well by audience standards was not in the picture at all at the beginning. Instead, my goal was to sing with fewer and fewer missed notes as time went on. It also was to use the proper techniques to converse with the audience, not to sing at them. My ultimate goal was to entertain, not necessarily to ever sound like Barbra Streisand or Celine Dion. Setting achievable goals and then working toward them, one step at a time, is the real key to getting everything that you want in business and private life. For example, the goals of building sales and building staff are typical in business. However, the daily approach to providing customer service and rapport that builds sales and finding talent and encouraging it that builds a staff is most important. Both audience appreciation for a singer and sales for a business will materialize when the basics have been covered using a step-by-step approach to fewer flat notes each time out. To implement the O for one step at a time, 1. List 5 or 6 tasks or projects you wish to accomplish at the beginning of each day. 2. Pick the most important single item on that list and make time to do it. And 3. Reward yourself when you've completed that most important task before you go on to the next item on your list. Remind yourself that anything else you manage to accomplish on your list is icing because you already have accomplished the primary task for the day. And that ends the O letter for one step at a time. Now I'm going to read the P letter, which is prepare to start over with permission to fail. Success is going from one failure to another with great enthusiasm. Who said that? Winston Churchill. I'll read it again. Success is going from one failure to another with great enthusiasm. I think I've mastered this one because I have a lot of failures, and it's okay. I do now, after many years of practice, embrace each failure. And though I'm disappointed and sometimes really upset with myself for making a silly mistake, I remember that most mistakes can be corrected, and that if I go around them or figure out a new way to do something, I will succeed. So I'm prepared that each event that I go into, each thing I do, each time I read to you, each time I talk to you, that it's practice, that nothing's perfect, and it's better to be imperfect than to not try at all. So here we go. And I say so a lot, which is another thing I'm going to work on. It's a failure to keep saying the same thing. A lot of people say like this, like that. You could count all the likes, even in Harvard law students who say like this, and I'm like that. I say so. We all have things we do that we want to stop doing. I stopped myself from saying so just now. I'm going to read this chapter. P, prepared to start over with permission to fail. Those who have it all often are those who've learned how to start over and over again. Being willing to start from scratch gives people a freedom to develop new businesses, products, or skills that they otherwise might not dare to attempt. One very successful businessman told me his story of working his way up the corporate ladder after starting out as a newspaper delivery boy. First, he built a small business, then felt helpless as he watched it fail miserably. He was able to pick himself up, though, and by working hard at a new job, soon proved that he could still support himself. After this experience, he knew that he could accomplish anything he wanted to do in the future if he just put his mind to it. This flexibility, along with a survivor's mentality, is very helpful in business. It may be that the experience of failing and then succeeding again helps people to develop the greatest mental strength. When I started writing music for my children's book, I already was familiar with the sounds of a piano, woodwind instruments, and mostly stringed instruments, most of the stringed instruments found in an orchestra. I had played piano and flute as a child, and my older daughter and I had practiced Suzuki violin together for 3 years. I purchased a sequencing program for my computer that hooked to a keyboard and allowed me to create my own music. When I had learned how to use the program and finished creating the music for 17 children's songs, I was very pleased with myself. However, a musician who was involved full-time in the music industry listened to my music and remarked that the drum parts I had created on my synthesizer were terrible. In fact, he used more graphic language than that to describe the strong distaste for what I had done. He said, "Robin, your tracks suck. Your drum tracks really suck." While I was disappointed with this frank assessment, I couldn't disagree with him. After all, I'd never played any drums except for a few toys when I was a child, and I'd had a limited sense of rhythm anyway. I used to sit in the high school band and pick up my flute whenever the girl next to me picked up hers. This is really true. I'm so embarrassed. And really, I didn't try to do any counting on my own. When this girl was absent one day, I had to take on the position of first flautist and lead the section. I had faked it so well for so long, the band teacher was shocked to see how poorly I performed without someone else taking the lead. Anyway, I decided that the only thing I could do to fix my poor sense of rhythm and my obvious drumming disability was to take a few drum lessons and see what I could learn. I called the local music store and got the name of a drum teacher who lived nearby. I then called this drum teacher and mentioned that my son and I would like to come take a few lessons together. At the last minute, my son decided not to take the lessons, so I went alone. I felt a little silly asking for drum lessons at my age. My teacher was still in his 20s, and it seemed pretty crazy for someone like me suddenly to want to play drums. Most of his students were in the 8 to 10 age bracket. I was breaking records here. In any case, I took the first two lessons and I was hooked. It really was fun learning how to hit those drums, and I could tell that I would be able to learn how to play quite well if I listened to this teacher. Over the next 3 years, I took the equivalent of one full year of drum lessons. I practiced and learned enough to know which music tracks sounded like a real drummer was playing and which did not. At the very least, I had a new appreciation for the amount of time and energy drummers must spend on their craft to become proficient. I reached a new level in starting over after I'd been playing drums for about 2 years. One day at a lesson, my teacher asked if I would do him a favor. He was playing in an orchestra concert that next Saturday afternoon and then had to go to a gig at a city bar immediately after the concert. Since he was going to be rushing just to make the performances times, he had no time to set up his drums at the bar. He wondered if I would meet a friend of his at this bar who would drop the drum set off. Since he just had taught me how to set up my own drum set, he wanted me to practice by setting up his set at a real gig. When I found myself on all fours trying to fix a broken foot pedal on a small, dark, and dirty stage in a bar full of people younger than me who were drinking beer and having fun, I knew that if I could do that, I could do anything. Somehow, I actually managed to set up the drums well enough so that when my teacher arrived in the middle of the second song, he was able to start playing immediately. I was so proud. Of course, I also realized if my friends saw what I was doing with my spare time, they would think that I had lost my mind. As it was, I actually made a mistake on his drum setup. And so after that first song, he had to fiddle around, looking very frustrated with me to make sure that his drums were in the right position. But I had gotten it started, and it was definitely better than if he'd had to unpack his cases himself. Since then, I've discovered several other large gaps in my music education. To reach my goal of becoming a better musician, I sat in on my daughter's Saturday morning music classes as we played the alto saxophones and percussion instruments in jazz and percussion ensembles as part of a conservatory program for high school students. Since I was unable to successfully impersonate a high school student, I had convinced the director and several teachers in this school to let me participate in these classes as the only adult groupie. I truly enjoyed the opportunity of spending time with my daughters and with the talented young musicians in the school. I also enjoyed the extra bonus of being able to embarrass my teenagers with occasional squeaky notes or with my latest high fashion choices of wearing socks with sandals. Starting over is a skill that becomes more refined each time you do it. When you first start out, everything is very serious. Young people often feel that they need to show the world that they are grown up and ready to handle jobs and social relationships. When you're older, starting over is more of a risk if your livelihood depends upon new successes. Middle-aged executives who have lost their jobs due to downsizing and the merging of corporations have a particularly difficult time finding new jobs and starting over in new careers. It's only the most resilient among them who can keep a positive attitude and find a new place to work. On the plus side, there's a certain relief that comes from being at square one again. Being a beginner means that you can ask questions instead of always answering them. It means that you can grow in new directions and challenge yourself in new areas. It means that there are fewer people trying to compete for your current position at the bottom. It also is easier to cope with the problems of starting over when you can remember a history of successes. As my businessman friend learned, once he failed and picked himself up, he never felt helpless again. Having to start over can turn into an advantage or a blessing in disguise, as if it were for another friend of mine, as it was for another friend of mine who lost his job and spent a year looking for a new one. Although he had to accept a decrease in pay, he found his new position to be the job he always wanted. It is a fact today, our society requires workers to be more flexible. It now is becoming commonplace for people to have worked in 3 or more careers and to have started over at least 2 or more times before they retire. Being prepared to start over by using the knowledge gained from previous experience is essential for people who want to stay in control of their lives and stay on the path that leads to having it all. And having it all does have to do with starting over a few times. My relief today at reading this to you is because I've started over as an online entrepreneur who's hoping to have a large audience so that I can share some of the things I've learned and make it a shortcut for you. But I'm starting over in terms of learning how to do videos, how to market things. Internet marketing is a whole field that other entrepreneurs have paved the way for, but have done for now almost 2 decades. And I had no idea this was all going on. So we're all beginners at something. Let's celebrate that and see what we can learn. That's the only way to get ahead and to keep your careers going on a path that will lead to ultimate success and satisfaction. In addition to being prepared to start over, it's important to give yourself and others permission to fail. Whether you're directing employees in a business organization or raising a 10-year-old, it's important to create an environment where those you supervise can reach their greatest potential. The only way I know to do this efficiently is to create an atmosphere where people know that if they make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. In our book writing group, we say, let's try for these tasks, the big task, the small task, and the self-care task, or be kind to me task. But people don't always do it. Things happen. They get into a work bind. They have trouble. They have an illness or a problem with a child. It's okay if you can't do it. We just make a commitment to do it the next time, and usually we succeed. But there's no judgment. There's no frustration over coming back into our group and feeling less than or diminished by others. It's often annoying, frustrating, and sometimes quite costly when mistakes are made. However, what seems most essential to future growth is that people understand that they will have other opportunities to try again. Without this mindset, it's easy to become discouraged and to decide not to try at all. The burnout often seen in troubled employees or entrepreneurs may be related to this problem. In fact, people have coined a word of overwhelm as if it's a noun. To become overwhelmed, to be overwhelmed, is to be taken over by too many things, too much pressure. But now people are using the word overwhelmed as the word overwhelm as if you have overwhelm or if you're taken by overwhelm. It's not really a noun, but it's become one because it's so commonplace and is used so frequently, especially in areas like coaching or consulting. The burnout, as I said, is seen in people who don't give themselves a chance to start over and who are frustrated by their failures. This is true in personal life as well. Although many of my friends learned to cook by helping their mothers in the kitchen, mine rarely required her children to help out in this area. Perhaps her view that she could do the job much faster with a lot less mess overrode her interest in having us learn how to cook. In any case, one day, without her permission, my girlfriend and I decided to try our skills at baking a cake. We were probably about 9 or 10 years old at the time. We'd heard that cake ingredients included flour, sugar, milk, and eggs. So we mixed some of these together into a pasty concoction. Then we put our mixture into a pan and turned on the oven. The result was a hard, flat, and tasteless kind of pancake. We did not burn the house down. But soon my friend was standing on a chair to put the flour away when it fell and flour spilled all over the counter and the floor. This was one of those big vats of flour. It was at this same time when my mother arrived home from shopping and walked in the door to discover the mess we'd made. We tore out of the house and ran next door to hide in my friend's bedroom closet. Smart, right? We figured my mother would never think to look for us there. After my mother marched directly into the neighbor's house and dragged me back home to be punished, I overheard her telling other people the story using the same line to describe the scene. And there was Janet, standing on my good kitchen chair, dropping all the flour all over the floor. While Janet and I later laughed about this incident, it's no surprise that I've developed very little interest in cooking as an adult. My mother's desire for tidy techniques in her domain of the kitchen, and she had been a physicist before she'd worked and found that women in those days were not given the same privileges as men, So she left to have a family. But when she realized that I was not permitted in there, so therefore I never felt an interest or felt comfortable learning to do anything well in that environment either. So my mother used that as her substitute for becoming a scientist at General Electric or being promoted into the position of vice president of GE, which had been her stated desire, which she spoke about her whole life into her 90s. She made the kitchen her domain. So therefore, I wasn't interested, I wasn't comfortable, and I didn't cook. Of course, there were many times when my mother provided the support needed for me to learn how to accept failure gracefully and to understand how I could do something better the next time. For example, when one of my boyfriends decided he wanted to date someone else, I didn't understand what had happened or what I'd done wrong. Later, I found out that another girl had told this boy some false stories about what I thought about him so that he would go out with her instead. It turned out the main thing I did wrong was that I didn't ask my boyfriend what was going on. I was too proud to confront him and simply accepted other people's observations that he now was with someone else. In my disappointment over this situation, my mother consoled me, talking about how there were other fish in the sea and how I would have another opportunity to communicate better with a boyfriend in the future. Of course, I soon discovered that she was right and eventually learned how I wanted to behave in relationships as new ones developed. In that case, I learned that it was important to speak up about possible miscommunications before others fill in the gaps for you. Behaving in a socially appropriate manner is a learned set of responses based largely upon trial and error. No matter how many books are read on a subject of interest, it's the experience of accepting failure gracefully while experimenting in that area that results in the greatest learning over time. Having important people around you willing to accept your failures as well as your successes adds the support needed to try again. I have seen the same situation occur in the workplace. Insecure managers who are afraid that others may catch them making a mistake, or employees who are afraid that someone else may come in and take their jobs, often behave in an overprotective and uncooperative manner. They do this out of a fear of their own failure, of being discovered as a fraud. Often, these people are quite talented, yet they're so afraid of making errors that they shut out others and limit their own opportunities in the process. Now, one of my friends, and it is the manager of several hundred employees in a large business that involves gambling. She's an honest person who's been promoted several times because of her attention to detail and ability to get along with the people she supervises. Recently, she was promoted to a new job that involves supervising several managers of different areas. The last time I talked with her, she complained about how one of the new managers she's supervising is making it impossible for her to do her job. She's tried several ways to find out exactly what this manager is doing on her job, but the manager leaves notes when she's away that no one is to touch anything on her computer. When asked for information about what she's doing, this manager answers my friend with curt responses that reveal minimal information. Since this manager handles some of the organization's money, my friend wonders if her employee is doing something corrupt, or if the woman is simply afraid that if someone else understands the details of how she does her job, she could be replaced. In my company, there also been past employees who developed niches in the business where they were the only ones who really knew how to do certain procedures. Since their occasional absence from work created instant problems, and once a near crisis, we worked to cross-train both managers and general employees to avoid this situation in the future. While some people may be more insecure about their positions and more protective about what they do, it's important to create an atmosphere where some failures are acceptable as long as they don't reoccur exactly the same way again. The antidote to failure in the promotion of a strong belief in yourself and in the fact that your efforts will eventually pay off. It's encouraging to watch athletes return to Olympic competition after experiencing embarrassing defeats in front of the world 4 years earlier. When there is a determination to win and competitors focus on the details of the job at hand, they can triumph. One television announcer who had been an athlete herself recently commented that a faltering Olympian had the physical talent to win at a world-class competition, but not the inner confidence. As he was performing, she remarked, "This guy just doesn't believe deep down that he can consistently complete this skill. This is what hurts him in a competition. The very next day, the same athlete found the courage to press on regardless of what other people were saying about him. In his final events, he demonstrated that he could perform under pressure and went home with the high scores that proved it. By acknowledging initial failure, accepting it, and determining to change the course of future events, it is possible to get what you want in life. To implement the P for prepare to start over with permission to fail. And again, this is so important. We fail often several times a day, but pushing on through that failure is the only way to success. And I should add, I recently joined an internet marketing program, and the key lesson is to make an ad, put it out there. And if it doesn't work, take it down and start again, make another ad. Focus on your mistakes and get better each time until you have a winning ad and you can be profitable on the internet. I believe that this lesson written a few years ago is key to my being successful in doing the next lesson in my life. So to implement the P for prepare to start over with permission to fail. 1, find something you've never done before and take the first steps needed to develop that activity or skill. Don't stop practicing until you've made at least 5 mistakes. There you go. 2, give yourself a list of too much work to do in one day. Then try to do it all anyway, giving yourself permission to fail if you haven't completed everything in that one day. The point is to try to do the impossible with permission to fail. Practice failing with a happy attitude. That's the key. People sometimes ask, why are you so enthusiastic? This and that happened to you. How can you go after this so much when you just failed at that and this and the other thing? Why? Because I don't see it as serious. Failure does not define you. It is a failure on some level, but it doesn't define you or your future. Whatever characteristics you have, whatever positive skills you have can propel you into your next success, because it won't all be failures. You will find success if you keep working through those failures. And lastly, list 3 times when you failed at something that was too hard for you at the time. Think of how you reacted, what you said to yourself about your abilities and self-worth. Then write how you plan to react to similar situations in the future. You will succeed. Go out there, be positive, take one step at a time, and prepare to fail, but gracefully. And then you will succeed. I promise. And now I'm going to figure out how to stop this recording. See you next time.